Good evening. My name is Stephen Zacharias, and I'm a museum educator here at the Campbell County Rockpile Museum located in Gillette, Wyoming. Welcome to this special virtual edition of Black and Yellow Theater, Voices of the Powder River Basin from the Black Hills to Yellowstone. Tonight featuring the Lakotas and the Black Hills, the struggle for sacred ground. Throughout tonight's program, please make use of the comment section should you have any questions, and we'll do our best to address them all towards the end of our time together. Our Black and Yellow Theater programming is designed to give our guests live, interactive experiences that will immerse and engage you in the diverse natural and cultural resources, history, and landscape of the Powder River Basin, which for centuries has been traversed by humans and animals alike during seasonal migrations necessary to survive and thrive on the Great Plains. It is estimated that the population of Turtle Island in 1491 was somewhere between 26 and 30 million people. Then in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Between 1776 and 1887, over 1.5 billion acres was seized from the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island by the United States government. And by the turn of the 20th century, only an estimated 237,000 natives of Turtle Island remained. Here at the Campbell County Rockpile Museum, we acknowledge that the land that we currently identify as Campbell County, Wyoming, to be the traditional and ancestral hunting grounds of the Apsaluk, the Nitsipi, the Sutai and Sisistas, the Oceti-Secoan, Numakiki, Haraka, Sanish, and the He Nanahe. Tonight, we pay respects to all the elders, past and present, and we choose to honor and acknowledge the original keepers of this land in hopes of building mutual respect and understanding across all cultures who reside and pass through here now and in the future. It is our hope by hosting programming like this, we can foster a mutual understanding across all cultures that will produce stronger and vital civic interactions amongst all citizens of the Powder River Basin. The Powder River Basin has been a culturally diverse landscape ever since it was first inhabited by the indigenous people of Turtle Island. And this evening, we are going to highlight one group from the Oceti-Secoan, or the Council of Seven Fires, the Lakota. The Lakota have long made their home in the majestic Black Hills, the heart of everything that is, drawing on the endless bounty for physical and spiritual sustenance. The arrival of settlers brought the Lakotas into unrelenting conflict with the ever-changing world, at a time when their tribal nation would produce some of the most famous natives in history, to include Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse. Dr. Jeffrey Ostler's powerful history of the Lakota struggle captures the heart of a people whose deep relationship with their homeland would compel them to fight for it against overwhelming odds on various battlefields, from the Battle of Greasy Grass to the chambers of the United States Supreme Court. Dr. Jeffrey Osler is the Beekman Professor of Northwest and Pacific History at the University of Oregon, where he teaches courses on the history of the American West and the American Indian history. His books include Surviving Genocide, Native Nations in the United States from the American Revolution to Bleeding Kansas, The Plains Sioux and U.S. Colonialism from Lewis and Clark to Wounded Knee, and Prairie Populism. He is the recipient of the Kahi Prize for Best Book in Western History from the Western History Association. Tonight's program will feature his 2010 book, The Lakotas and the Black Hills, The Struggle for Sacred Land. Dr. Osler resides on the traditional homelands of the Kayupuya people in what is now the state of Oregon. Dr. Osler, thank you so much for taking the time this evening to share with us all.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for inviting me. And I very much appreciate the land acknowledgement and also the mention that, in fact, the University of Oregon and where I am, Eugene, Oregon, is on Kalapuya Ilahi, the traditional indigenous homelands of the Kalapuya people. I just want to read the land acknowledgement that faculty at the University of Oregon have written. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they contribute to make important contributions to their community, to my university, the University of Oregon, and to the world. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you all in the audience for your patience. So I was talking about Black Elk's vision. This is an image of it that was drawn by a relative of his named Standing Bear. And then this is Black Elk Speaks, as told to the Nebraska poet John Neihardt. The place the six grandfathers took Black Elk in his vision was known for several decades as Harney Peak, the highest point in what Lakotas call Paha Sapa or He Sapa, the Black Hills. 5 years ago, though, a federal government board renamed it Black Elk Peak. The Black Hills, of course, today are best known as the site of Mount Rushmore. And at least before COVID, over 3 million tourists a year on average were visiting Mount Rushmore, known as the Shrine of Democracy. But few of them, I think, give very much thought to Black Elk or to the Lakotas, who consider the Black Hills their sacred land. Lakotas do not much like Mount Rushmore. John Lame Deer, a Lakota medicine man, once put it this way: whites, he said, could just as well have carved this mountain into a huge cavalry boot standing on a dead Indian. Mount Rushmore and the Black Hills reveal in an especially stark way basic themes in the history of North America since the coming of Europeans, contrasting visions about land, the often violent dispossession of Native people, and Native people's struggles to survive and rebuild their communities. So in my presentation this evening, I'm going to explore these issues by considering the history of the Lakotas and the Black Hills, and I'm going to divide my presentation into 3 parts. First of all, before the United States took or stole the Black Hills. Second, how the United States did do that, how the United States took or stole the Black Hills. And the third part will be how Lakotas have tried to remedy this injustice. Now, in telling the story of the Lakotas and the Black Hills, many non-Native historians say that Lakotas, quote, discovered the Black Hills fairly recently, around 1775 or 1776. And in this way of thinking, Lakotas, or Tetons as they're designated on this map, were living among their Dakota relatives in Minnesota in the 1600s and gradually moved west, pushed by conflict with Ojibways and pulled by opportunities to hunt beaver and bison for emerging European markets. And only, according to this way of thinking, only after smallpox decimated the more powerful Mandans along the Missouri River could Lakotas move west and, quote, discover the Black Hills. And I should say that all the groups on this map are collectively known, as Stephen mentioned in his introduction, as the Ochete Chacon, or the 7 Council Fires. Now, Lakota historians dispute this idea of the Lakotas discovering the Black Hills in, say, 1776. And in his recent book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance, Nick Estes argues that the idea that the Lakotas discovered the Black Hills in 1776 is based on a misreading of winter counts. And various Lakota bands had winter counts which marked each year or winter by recording a significant event with a pictograph on a hide, and it was accompanied then by an oral recounting of that particular event. And in my view, although it's true that the Lakotas did not control the Black Hills until the early 1800s, and it's true that they fought with other Native nations for control of the Black Hills and other areas, as well as establishing alliances with various nations, they did spend time in the Black Hills. They knew a great deal about the Black Hills much earlier than 1776. The Black Hills, here in an aerial shot, were important to Lakotas economically. So they provided an extraordinary range of resources, timber, which was scarce on the surrounding plains, more medicinal plants than anywhere else, berries that could be harvested in the summer and early fall. The Black Hills also held deep spiritual or religious significance. And in part, this was because the Black Hills contained an unusual wealth of sacred sites, particular places where sun dances were held, places that were particularly suitable for vision quests, and places where foundational events had occurred. Devil's Tower, known to Lakotas as Mato Tipila, meaning bear teepee, was created when several girls who wandered away from their camps were chased by bears. Suddenly the earth rose, carrying the girls out of reach as the pursuing bears clawed frantically at the rising earth, creating the long crevices that you see here. The girls were then rescued by birds sent by Fallen Star, one of the Lakotas' cultural heroes. Another significant site is Wind Cave, the place where the buffalo originated, in one telling like a string of tiny ants, who then, as they inhaled the breath of life, grew to their natural size. Then the buffalo stampeded through a place called the Doorway of the Buffalo, or known now as Buffalo Gap, onto the plains. It's also clear that the Black Hills as a whole, as a sort of single entity, were regarded as uniquely sacred. The image of Black Elk's vision shows this. You can see the hills there ringed by this sort of pink circle. And I want to call your attention to that feature, that kind of pink ring around the Black Hills. It's a sandstone impression, which is known as the racetrack. And here's a geological image of the racetrack. You can see, again, it's kind of pink to indicate that sandstone, and you can see it kind of ringing the Black Hills in this geological map. In Lakota oral tradition, the racetrack was created when the Thunder Beings declared that there would be a race between the two-leggeds, the birds, and the four-leggeds, the animals. When the race starts, a magpie flies onto a buffalo near his ear and sits there while the animals and birds race each other along a large circular track. The race lasts for days and days. One day it's so windy that the birds can't fly and the animals get ahead, but another day it's so hot that the animals can't run, and so the birds catch up. Another day, torrential rains kill some of the birds. Still, the magpie sits on the buffalo's ear. Eventually, the birds and the animals near the finish. The buffalo is in the lead with the four-leggeds cheering him on. Just before the finish, however, the magpie takes off and flies toward the finish line. Weak from a lack of food, the magpie can't stay in the air very long, but falls to earth just across the finish line, and so the birds win the race. The weight of the animals racing around and around the area within the track causes that area within the track to rise as the race is going on, and that area bursts into flames. And that explains then the origins of the Black Hills. So now to the second part of my presentation, how the U.S. took or stole the Black Hills. U.S. settlers began trespassing on Lakota lands in the 1840s. And these particular settlers didn't actually want Lakota lands. Rather, they were traveling through Lakota lands on their way to out here, where I am, Oregon, first of all, in the 1840s. Late in the 1840s, Mormons to Utah. And then, of course, with the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, California, increasingly to California in the late 1840s and, of course, in the 1850s. Now, we might think of the Oregon Trail as just simply that, a trail. A trail might be 6 yards wide or maybe 20 or 30 yards wide, but it was actually not a trail. It was a highway in a certain way. It was probably about 20 miles wide at many points. And the main reason, of course, is that the overlanders had livestock with them, and the animals needed to graze, and so they spread out. And as they came in through Lakota country, from a Lakota perspective, of course, the overlanders were not just going through single file, but they were destroying the land. Their livestock were grazing in the spring as the overlanders were setting out in the spring. And the spring, of course, was a time when the grasses were needed for their own horses and also for the buffalo. And in the 1840s and 1850s, buffalo were becoming increasingly scarce along the Platte River and into southeastern Wyoming. And Lakotas saw that the overlanders were driving, they would say, or scaring away the buffalo. And Lakotas frequently complained to government officials about this. And government officials decided that they needed to negotiate a treaty with the Lakotas and other Native nations in the region. And this was the first Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. And what the 1851 treaty did was that it imposed or created tribal boundaries, didn't actually take land. It also provided some compensation for damage to Lakota lands. And it created a mechanism, the mechanism primarily centered around restitution, for resolving any conflicts that would emerge in the future between overlanders and Lakotas. The problem with this mechanism, though, for resolving conflicts was that U.S. officials would be the judge and the jury as it would turn out. And so 2 years after the treaty, in 1853, violence erupted when U.S. officials insisted on punishing Lakotas who had killed a cow that had wandered away from its Mormon owner, rather than allowing, as Lakotas wanted to do, to make restitution under the framework of the treaty. The government punished them. And then 2 years later, General William S. Harney massacred 86 Sicangu Lakotas under the leadership of a chief named Little Thunder. In that 86 included many women and children at Ash Hollow, Nebraska, which I've marked with the sort of reddish arrow. For this atrocity, Lakotas named Harney Woman Killer, and you can see why Lakotas wanted to rename Harney Peak. As the U.S. continued to provoke Lakotas, war would continue for over 20 years. One provocation was the discovery of gold in western Montana in the early 1860s. Prospectors made their way up the Oregon Trail, and then at Fort Laramie, they cut to the northwest across a new route, not too far to the west from where you are in the museum there, along the Bozeman Trail. And the Bozeman Trail cut right through critical Lakota hunting territories. Lakotas and their Cheyenne allies fought back, and in 1866, they set a deadly trap for U.S. Army troops at Fort Phil Kearny. Using decoys, they lured a detachment of infantry across a ridge and into an ambush where they killed all 80 soldiers. And this is a pictograph from one of the winter counts that I mentioned earlier, showing that particular event, marking that year. And the Americans are marked with hats in this particular case. And you can see the horse hooves, the prints, and then you can also see the dots are gunfire. That military victory at Fort Phil Kearny gave Lakotas significant leverage with the United States, and it led to another treaty, the 1868 treaty, also signed at Fort Laramie. And what this treaty did was that it recognized a portion of Lakota territory as a permanent reservation. And you can see it there on the map. It's marked as the Great Sioux Reservation, and it includes most of modern-day western South Dakota and a little bit up into North Dakota. And it also has other categories of lands. And that was what the written treaty indicated. In fact, Lakotas did not understand the treaty as to involve a land cession at all. It was never explained to them to be a treaty that involved a land cession. And what had happened is that, the government had written things into the treaty that they actually had not explained to people. You can see here also that the Black Hills, in most of them in western South Dakota, are encompassed in that permanent reservation, that Great Sioux Reservation territory. And the 1868 treaty also said that any subsequent modifications of that treaty would require the consent of 3/4 of all adult men. And that provision will become important in our story. For a long time, there had been rumors of gold in the Black Hills. And in 1873, there was a financial panic in the United States, which led to an economic depression that lasted for 5 years. And in this context of a national economic depression, the idea that there might be a new place to discover gold was particularly appealing for the United States. For one thing, it would provide an outlet for social unrest. Unemployed people could go out there and mine. But more importantly, a new discovery of gold might stimulate the economy. And so in 1874, the United States government sponsored a military expedition into the Black Hills. And to lead the expedition, the Army chose a flamboyant officer with an especially strong talent for publicity and self-promotion, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer led an expedition of close to 1,000 men into the Black Hills. The official rationale of the expedition was to find a suitable location for a fort, but the unofficial purpose of the expedition was to look for gold, which they indeed found. And in Custer's phrase, they found it among the roots of the grass. This was a phrase, I think, that invoked the already well-developed myth of America's agrarian past on behalf of an industrial future. Predictably, word of the discovery of gold in the Black Hills encouraged prospectors to invade the Black Hills. At first, the Army made some attempts to evict them, since it was a treaty violation. Them going in there was a violation of the 1868 treaty. But these efforts were ultimately abandoned. And in December of 1875, the government ordered Lakotas who were off the permanent reservation to report to the reservation by the end of January. So I'm bringing this map up again. Many of the Lakotas are not on that permanent reservation, and they're hunting in areas that are marked really in your area of Wyoming under the Article 16 lands, and also up into Montana. And so the government is ordering those people to come onto the permanent reservation in South Dakota and report to agencies. And the government also says if they refuse to comply with this order, that the Army would use force. Most Lakotas living to the northwest of the Black Hills in the Powder River country up into Montana, led by very famous men, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and others, were determined to defend their lands militarily, and so they remained where they were. The Army then, in the spring of 1876, sent troops to the region, confident that they could whip the Sioux into subjection, but the Lakotas and the Cheyennes won two key battles. One of them against General Crook at the Rosebud, and the other more famously at the Greasy Grass, or Little Bighorn, on June 20th, 1876, when they wiped out Custer's 7th Cavalry. This is a ledger drawing from a Lakota perspective of the Greasy Grass. Lakotas had won a great military victory at the Little Bighorn, but they were nonetheless unable to prevent the United States from taking the Black Hills. 2 months after the Little Bighorn, U.S. negotiators met with Lakotas and secured the signatures of 230 men assenting to the sale of the Black Hills. And this was only about 10% of adult men. And that, of course, was far short of the requirement that I mentioned earlier under the 1868 treaty that they needed 3/4 to agree to any treaty modification. And here then is what Lakota territory looks like after the 1876. It's called an agreement, and then becomes an act of Congress in 1877. Why, we might ask, did Lakota leaders, those that did, agree to cede the Black Hills? Some Lakotas later alleged that, quote, the soldiers went from camp to camp, getting every chief to sign the treaty by filling them up with liquor. A little bit of that happened, but I don't think that's really the answer. The larger problem was that Lakotas faced the prospect of starvation. And the reason for this is that buffalo populations had declined severely over the previous 2 decades, to the point that the bison were on the verge of extinction. This is an image from the 1880s of bison bones being gathered from the plains. This is actually from up in Saskatchewan, not in Lakota territory, but just illustrated, and then being put on rail cars to be shipped to fertilizer plants. And so because Lakotas didn't have the buffalo, they couldn't support themselves anymore. That had been taken from them. That meant that Lakotas were dependent on the government for food, and the treaty commissioners took advantage of that. And they threatened to cut off the Lakotas' supply of rations if they did not sign. And this has been called the sell or starve policy. So many Lakotas felt that they really had no choice but to sign, given that they were in between a rock and a hard place. But even as they signed the treaty, they registered silent protest. One man named Fire Thunder approached the table where the treaty was there to make his mark. And when he came up, he had a blanket in front of his eyes, and he signed blindfolded. And that was a gesture that silently rebuked statements that the U.S. treaty commissioners had repeatedly made throughout the negotiations that they did not wish to throw a blanket over the Indians' eyes. So now to the third part of my presentation, the Lakotas struggle to obtain justice for the taking or the theft of the Black Hills. From the U.S. perspective, the taking of the Black Hills was self-evidently just and also irreversible. And I think you can see a sense of Americans at the time of the irreversibility of progress in this fairly famous 1872 painting by John Gast called American Progress, which illustrates the ideology of manifest destiny. In sharp contrast, though, to that American view, Lakotas did not think that the taking of the Black Hills was either just or irreversible. Immediately, Lakotas began to protest the taking of the Black Hills. In late 1876, several Lakotas, including this man, Fast Thunder, volunteered to serve as scouts in the U.S. Army in exchange for promises to reopen the Black Hills matter. And they went to Washington to try to appeal to U.S. officials. That didn't work, but nonetheless, Lakotas persisted. As time went on, Lakotas decided that regaining the Black Hills, at least for the time being, was probably impractical. And so what we see as the most visible thing that they were doing was that they began to focus their efforts on obtaining monetary compensation for the unjust taking. Their first organized effort for monetary compensation took place in 1892. And that 1892 was 2 years after the Wounded Knee Massacre, in which the 7th Cavalry slaughtered as many as 300 Lakotas, the majority women and children. And this, by the way, is a painting of the massacre by the great Dakota painter Oscar Howe. The date is 1959. Seeking to appeal to potentially sympathetic Americans, 792 Lakotas in 1892 signed a petition requesting $10 million for the taking of the Black Hills. There were many other petitions. And at first, government officials tried to squelch these petitions, but Lakota's persistence eventually forced government officials to allow the Lakotas a hearing. And in 1920, the Congress of the United States passed legislation allowing the Lakotas to submit a claim for the Black Hills to a thing called the U.S. Court of Claims. And then the Lakotas needed an attorney. And so they selected an attorney, this man named Ralph Case. Ralph Case had grown up in South Dakota near the Cheyenne River Reservation. His father was an employee of the Bureau of Indian Affairs on that reservation. And Case had some real sympathy for Lakotas and their struggle for justice. Ralph Case filed the Black Hills claim in 1923. And what he did is argued that the taking of the Black Hills violated the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, particularly under the clause that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And he argued that Lakotas should receive compensation for the value of the lands taken at the time of the taking, 1876. And he further argued that Lakotas should receive a share of the gold that had been mined since, plus interest on the value of the lands in 1876. And the total claim that he put forward would have been for $600 million. The odds against this claim succeeding at the time were very high. The relevant judicial precedents under a legal doctrine known as congressional plenary power gave Congress the right essentially to do anything it wanted in regard to Native Americans, which meant that Case's argument that Congress had acted improperly in 1877 was likely to receive the response that no court could question Congress's judgment under that doctrine of plenary power. And even in the unlikely event that Lakotas won the claim, it was highly doubtful that the Court of Claims would award them anything more than the value of the land at the time of the taking. The idea that they would award them for some share of the gold since then was probably just made no sense within the way that such courts operated at that time. And of course, there was no legal requirement, even if a claim was settled for the Lakotas, that the government would have to pay interest since 1876, as Ralph Case wanted them to do. So even if there was an award, it would be very small, much less than the $600 million. And even if there was an award, an additional obstacle was that the government was sure to argue that any award should be offset by the amount the government had spent since 1876 supporting the Lakotas. And so there might be a monetary award, but then the government would say, but anyway, Lakotas owe us that money back. So in sum, it was highly unlikely that they would win. And even if they won, the monetary award would be small and it might well disappear through offsets. It took the Court of Claims 19 years until 1942 to make a ruling. And when they did, they rejected the claim. The decision of the Court of Claims is actually confusing. I've read it, other people have read it, including later judges, and it's confusing. Some portions of the decision said or seemed to say that the court had no jurisdiction over the claim at all, and that was the basis for dismissal. Other parts of the decision, though, addressed the merits of the claim and rejected the merits. But either way, for the moment in 1942, either way, it hardly mattered, since it now looked like the Lakotas' struggle for justice in the form of monetary compensation was dead. And the completion of Mount Rushmore a year earlier, it was actually 1941, in a way symbolically reinforced this sense of closure on U.S. terms. But in 1946, the Lakotas' claim received a second life when the United States created a new court, the Indian Claims Commission, specifically to resolve Indian claims, not just Lakota claims, but all kinds of claims by tribes throughout the United States, and there were many. Part of the rationale for the creation of the ICC was that since so many Native Americans had fought in the U.S. Army during World War II, it was only right that the government should address their grievances. And so with the creation of the ICC, that allowed Ralph Case on behalf of the Lakotas, and he was in contact with Lakotas throughout this process. It allowed him to refile the claim, and he did so in 1950. This time, it took only 4 years for a ruling, but the result was the same. In 1954, the ICC rejected the Lakotas' claim. By this time, Ralph Case had spent 30 years on the claim. Ralph Case was close to 80 years old. He was in poor health and drinking heavily. Lakotas had grown impatient with his lack of success, as you can understand, and they began to question the way that he had handled the claim. Maybe he had just blown it, people began to think. And Lakotas felt that it was time for Case to go. They wanted to be kind to him, and so they gently eased him out. Tragically, a year after he was eased out, Ralph Case was hit by a car while crossing the street at his home in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and died a few days later. In the meantime, Lakotas had gone about hiring new attorneys to pursue the claim. And the two attorneys that they hired, Arthur Lazarus and Marvin Sinosky, revived the claim. And what they did, it was kind of amazing that they got away with this, is that they went back to the Court of Claims, which still oversaw the Indian Claims Commission, and they argued that Ralph Case had been incompetent. He had just blown it. And the Court of Claims agreed with that argument and granted a rehearing before the ICC. So the claim is refiled by the new attorneys in the late 1950s, and it went on for quite a while. In 1974, it took that long for the ICC to rule on the claim again. And this time we have something new. The Indian Claims Commission upholds the Lakotas' claim that the Black Hills was an unjust taking and deserved to be addressed. And it was a decision that centered on the violation of the 1868 treaty by the government not adhering to the 3/4 provision. And so because of that, the court ruled the taking of the Black Hills was an improper taking under the Fifth Amendment. So this was a remarkable turn of events. Courts had turned down the Lakotas' claim for decades. Now suddenly a court upholds the claim. Why had this happened? The answer, I think, isn't so much because any new legal doctrines had intervened. The courts were basically operating with the same set of legal precedents. They could read them in different ways if they wanted. But I think the main thing is that by the 1970s, many US Americans had developed a new perspective on their history. For a variety of reasons, and I think the members of this Indian Claims Commission in 1974 had been influenced by some of these larger considerations for a variety of reasons, including, for example, the civil rights movement's challenge to a history of racial injustice, mounting criticism of the Vietnam War, and also new perspectives on Native American history that were being reflected in books like D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was published in the early 1970s and was a searing indictment of US actions toward Native Americans in the 19th century. By the early 1970s, US Americans were far less inclined to celebrate a history of the winning of the West. And many Americans, certainly not all, were willing to admit to a long history of broken promises and dishonorable dealings with Native Americans. The 1974 decision was a great victory for the claim, but there were two problems. One is that it was necessary to determine the monetary value of the land in 1876 to decide on an amount. And then once an amount had been determined, there was that question that had been possible all along, which was how much of that amount of an award should be offset by subsequent government support for Lakotas. And so there was this lingering problem of offsets. To avoid the very real possibility that offsets would devour an award, the Lakotas attorneys approached South Dakota Senator James Aborisk, an Arab American who was sympathetic to the Lakotas' position, to sponsor legislation in Congress that would exempt the Lakotas' claim from any offsets. And that legislation went through. There's Senator Aborisk. And so that problem was solved by congressional legislation. But there was a second problem. The Justice Department appealed the decision on the grounds of res judicata. And res judicata is a doctrine that a case once decided cannot be relitigated. And what the Justice Department did was that it went back to the 1942 Court of Claims decision, and it read it as saying that they had dismissed the case not simply on jurisdictional grounds, but on substantive grounds, on the basis of the merit. And because of that, they said it's already been decided, and under this legal doctrine of res judicata, you couldn't undecide that. It was over. And so the Court of Claims then overruled the 1974 Indian Claims Commission decision and dismissed it. And again, it looked like the claim was dead. So many times in this process, it looked like the claim was dead. But the Lakota's attorneys revived the claim again by calling on, once again, Senator Aborisk to sponsor legislation that, once again in the Congress, would exempt the Black Hills claim from this legal doctrine of res judicata. And so that legislation passed the Congress, and so that problem was also solved. That meant that the 1974 decision was still in force. The government continued to appeal it, and it actually then went finally to the Supreme Court in 1980. And the Supreme Court upheld the 1974 decision, and it called the dealings of the United States with the Lakotas a ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealing. It upheld the decision, and it awarded Lakotas $17 million was determined to be the value of the land in 1876, and then interest since $85 million, equaling now $102 million in 1980. Now, at one time, Lakotas would have hailed this decision as a victory. But 3 weeks after the Supreme Court's ruling, the tribal attorney for the Oglala Sioux tribe, that's the Pine Ridge Reservation, Mario Gonzalez, filed suit in U.S. District Court rejecting the monetary award and asking for the return of the Black Hills, plus $11 billion, that's a B, $11 billion in damages for denial of the tribe's use and occupancy of the Black Hills. And those cases actually didn't succeed, but they represented now the fact that Lakotas had started to think, and that they continue to think, that monetary compensation is not the answer, and they have declared over and over again that the Black Hills are not for sale. So this new attitude, we want the land, not the money, reflected major changes that had taken place in Lakota country during the 1960s and 1970s as Native Americans everywhere mobilized in new ways to assert their treaty rights and to protest historical injustices. Native activism during this period of time, of course, is most commonly associated with the American Indian Movement, AIM, organized in 1968, and the actions that AIM undertook. The occupation of Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay Harbor in 1969, the Trail of Broken Treaties to Washington in 1972, and the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. AIM also occupied Mount Rushmore in 1970, saying that Mount Rushmore was not the shrine of democracy, but it was actually the hoax of democracy. And this image is of Dennis Banks, one of the key AIM leaders, an Ojibwe who passed in 2017. It's sometimes forgotten that AIM actually did not initiate the occupation of Mount Rushmore in 1970. And in fact, it was originally initiated not by AIM, but by non-AIM Lakotas who had gone there. AIM came in later. And one of the key people who organized the initial occupation is this man, Lehman Brightman, who was a doctoral student at the University of California, Berkeley at the time, came back to Lakota country and was involved in the occupation. And he was interviewed by a CBS News crew at the time, and in 1970 called for the return of the Black Hills. That was 10 years before the Supreme Court decision. Many Lakotas during this period of time opposed AIM's tactics. Many favored them. And there, in fact, was bitter and sometimes violent conflict between AIM-affiliated or AIM-sympathetic and non-AIM-affiliated Lakotas. But all Lakotas agreed on one thing in the 1980s, which was that monetary compensation should be rejected and the Black Hills returned. How would this happen? In 1983, three Lakotas, Mario Gonzalez, who I mentioned earlier, Fred Brewer, and Michael Hermenihorse is pictured here, who passed in 2019, drafted legislation to return most of the public lands in the Black Hills. So it would have returned about 1.3 million of the 7.3 total acreages. It would have left private property alone. It was only about public lands, and it would have created a system of co-management with the federal agencies. To get this bill that they had drafted before Congress, none of them were members of Congress, Michael Hermenihorse has approached a senator from New Jersey named Bill Bradley. And Bradley had known Michael Hermenihorse since 1974, when Bradley, who was then playing professional basketball for the New York Knicks, put on a basketball clinic at Pine Ridge with his teammate, Phil Jackson. And Phil Jackson had played basketball for the University of North Dakota Fighting Sioux. So he was from that area. This is an image of the Fighting Sioux, although in 2015 their name was changed, I think appropriately so, to the Fighting Hawks. So Bradley did introduce the Sioux Nation Black Hills Act into the Senate in 1985, but it gained little traction. And the basic problem was simple, that most non-Indians living in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Wyoming opposed returning any part of the Black Hills to the Lakotas. They thought history was over and we should move on. And of course, their elected representatives, governors, congresspeople, senators also opposed returning the Black Hills. And so there were some congressional hearings on the Bradley bill, but because of the fact that the local senators and representatives opposed the legislation, other senators and Congress people were not willing to sign on in the absence of local support. And so eventually the Bradley bill wound up dying in Congress without moving forward. Over the past 25 years, the money the Supreme Court awarded in 1980 continues to accrue interest, and the amount on the award has increased from $102 million in 1980 to well over $1 billion, maybe close to $2 billion today. On July 3rd, 2020, just recently, then President Donald Trump visited the Black Hills and gave a speech at Mount Rushmore, followed by a controversial fireworks display. At the time of his visit, around 200 Lakota activists blocked one of the roads leading to Mount Rushmore. One of the activists, Nick Tilson, a leader of the Land Back movement, said that the intention behind the action was to continue the fight to return the Black Hills to the Lakota people. Every generation since the land was taken, he said, we have fought to get it back. And many of us, including myself, grew up around this movement to get our land back. So that was what they were protesting there on July 3rd. And many of them were arrested. In fact, Tilson is currently facing felony charges. He's not incarcerated, but he's out because of COVID, but he is facing felony charges. Whether Lakotas regain the Black Hills or a portion of them, and if so soon, I guess none of us really know. What is clear, though, is that a story that began long ago is not yet complete. For well over 100 years, Lakotas have worked hard to obtain justice for the theft of sacred land. Their efforts teach us that the course of history does not follow a fixed script. Maybe they will succeed, and we ought not to underestimate that possibility. So thank you very much. That is my conclusion.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time this evening to share with us. I really appreciate you also mentioning the events of this summer, specifically Nick Tilson and the Indian Collective and the Land Back movement. That is something that is, of interest to all of us here. It is challenging to see these people protest on their native soil and to be told to go back home, and when they're standing in the middle of their home. And Nick facing 17 years in prison for trying to defend his home peacefully is a big concern.
Yeah.
With this story not being complete, do you see yourself perhaps doing a new edition of this particular book, or adding on or writing a part 2 in the future?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I've really been focused on some other things right now. And, I'm working, I've started really after this book, which was over 10 years ago. I really started thinking about the question of genocide generally in U.S. history. And so I've completed a book that talks about genocide and Indian removal in the eastern part of the United States. That came out a year ago. And I've begun working on a kind of follow-up book to that, which would focus on the western part of the United States, including Lakota history, but also Oregon and California and all throughout the American West. And so, I've been so focused on that, Stephen, that honestly, what you've said is interesting. You think it might have occurred to me, but to be perfectly honest, it actually hasn't. But it might be something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. What did you, in the course of your research, in the course of putting this book together, the thing I appreciate is that you do have it in 3 parts, where it's pre-settler, post-settler, and then into the modern era, even though this fight is still going on today. What was the most common thread, or the thing that stood out to you the most in the Lakota culture, the Lakota people as a whole, from that earliest research you've done to the modern day?
Well, I just, and there's many Lakota people perhaps in the audience tonight. I don't know for sure, but, when I started to meet Lakota people and spend some time with them, I was just struck by the strength of their spirit. And, you think of all the things they've been through, and, their tenacity, their strength of spirit. And I think in the Black Hills claim, of course, the way I've told the story necessarily does have quite a bit in it about the period of the claim where, it's being run by non-Lakotas. Ralph Case is a Lakotas didn't have attorneys for a long period of time. Now they've got all kinds of attorneys. And so it kind of emphasizes them in the background. But the whole time, they're really persevering. And I think that they, continue to have hope that things can get better. I was very struck, Stephen, when I was, this was 2017, when I was asked to be on a panel this was right after the Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock, in 2016. And in early 2017, after Trump had gone ahead with the pipeline and, the authorities had broken up the water protectors there at Standing Rock, there was a panel and one of the participants was a man named Louis Grassrope. And he talked about being there. He was among the water protectors for months. And he talked about how being there had given him hope in a way that he just hadn't had for a long time. And that was amazing to me because, in a certain sense, they lost. They didn't stop the pipeline. Maybe they will eventually, It's not that story's over either. But just the fact that he said he had hope, I found very inspiring, because if Lakota people, for all they've been through, can continue to persevere and think ahead, it's how they do the 7 generations and the future of our people, then I think that's quite inspiring. And those of us who are non-natives, I think, can learn something from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of that, especially that last point there about learning for us non-natives, you're in the academic field there at the University of Oregon. We're a museum that's here on occupied land, essentially. One thing that I have tried to promote as much as I can is my father's a history teacher. I've been a student of history all my life. But I'm really interested in the cultures and the people that lived through history. And what is the best way for an academic or somebody in the museum field to help decolonize and to give space for these groups to have their stories told from their perspective and not from, is it the Battle of Little Bighorn or is it the Battle of Greasy Grass? It depends on which side you're giving the mic to, right?
Yeah.
So what have you found, especially in your ability to go in and amongst the cultures to gather stories and then put them into book form? What are possibly some secret tricks or techniques that you've learned that are valuable in that?
Well, a lot of my work right now really relies on the work of other historians. And so one of the things I try to do is seek out academics who are Native. And, they are, of course, connected to their own communities in very particular ways. And I feel that it's important to talk to them and listen to what they're saying about, because a lot of our work is the writing of histories and it's a kind of academic work, and those books are read by people. And it matters, I think, if we're telling good stories or if we're telling, stories that leave out or erase or distort. And so my work is a lot right now, because I'm not working on the history of any particular single communities. It's very general sort of overview of the United States and relation with indigenous nations generally. So I really try to consult and listen to Native historians. And, there are academic spaces where Native historians and scholars, literature scholars, anthropologists are somewhat empowered. One of them is a group called the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, which is not just U.S. people, but also scholars from the First Nations in Canada, Aboriginal scholars in Australia, Maori scholars from New Zealand, and so on. And it's really an organization that is controlled by Native scholars, and they kind of set an agenda, and non-Native people can participate and learn and contribute. So it's not a full decolonization of the academy at all, but, it's a space that has been opened up, within the world of universities and academics. Now, to translate that to more local levels, I think that if people like you have better thoughts on this than I do, I'm sure, working in a museum where you're right on the ground and you can relate to people from the local Native communities. I think that, we just have to be sure to listen to people, to make space for them, foremost space for them to talk about what they want to talk about, to correct us where we need to be corrected, to share with us perspectives that they want us to know, to think about. So to give them that space. But also, I think I don't know if you found this in your work, I think there can be a problem, though, that if, we have to be sensitive not to demand too much of people either, and not to put burdens on them that, maybe burdens that are unfair for them to take on. And so can be a little bit of that issue, about maybe asking people to speak when they may not really want to, and having them do too much of that kind of work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely does. I appreciate that. Before we go tonight, I do have one question. This fight has been going on for a long time. There are court cases that essentially say the people of Black Hills are in the right here. That they were wronged and it needs to be corrected. Do you believe in our lifetime that we're going to see a conclusion to this story where that wrong is finally put back, as the courts say, to the people of the Lakotas?
It's hard to say, Steve, and I, like so many people right now, I feel, we're on kind of a knife's edge, and I worry about the direction we're going. I think there's some real positive things that are happening that suggest we're possibilities of some real good changes. I was heartened by the Black Lives Matter protests and just a kind of broader support in, among general Americans of whatever racial background for recognizing that we have a history of systemic racism. And I'm heartened by, I think my students see this, that we need to get a better sense of our history, and that we have injustices and we've got to deal with them. We just have to. But on the other hand, some things that are going on in the country and the world frighten me. And are we going to be going backwards? If some of the darker forces that I think have been empowered lately in dangerous ways, this is my view, and they'll continue to try, to be empowered. And so I think it's a plastic moment, that we're in. And I hope, I'm 65. I'd love to be around for a while longer. And I hope in that time we can move forward, and particularly on this issue, even if what we're talking about is just simply what the Bradley bill would have called for, which is the return of federal lands and co-management. And maybe for some Lakotas that wouldn't be enough. I'm not sure on that. But just to put that on the table seems like a pretty straightforward thing that a lot of people, I think, could really get behind. Maybe something like that could really happen.
Yeah, that would be excellent. Dr. Osler, I really want to thank you for taking the time this evening to share with us. This is great and important work, especially in our neighborhood. So I really appreciate you taking the time after your classes today to log in and bear with us through the technical difficulties and present. It was an excellent evening. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice of you to say the technical difficulties when I created them, but
oh no, it was all right. I haven't had a program yet where something didn't pop up.
Right.
I do want to mention we are located here right off of Interstate 90. When you're trekking west or east across the country, we're about halfway between the Black Hills and Yellowstone National Park. So we
Right.
encourage you to pull off the interstate. We're open Mondays through Saturdays. And if you're in the local area and you'd like to pick up a copy of Dr. Osler's book, The Lakotas and the Black Hills, The Struggle for Sacred Ground, it is available here in our gift shop. So swing on by. We'll be open tomorrow, 8 to 5, every Monday through Saturday. Swing by and pick up a copy of the book. Again, Dr. Osler, thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. Everybody who tuned in and bared with us through the whole program, thank you all so much for participating. Please hit that subscribe button if you are following on YouTube, and make sure you like the page if you're over there on Facebook. That way you can stay up to date on all our future programs, both here in person and online. Everybody have a great evening, be safe, and we'll see you next time here from the Rock Pile Museum in Gillette, Wyoming.